Some men choose isolation. Others have it chosen for them. Caleb Hartwell had stopped counting the days somewhere. Around year 3, when the silence became less suffocating and more like armor. 8 years in the same cabin on the same stretch of cracked earth, watching the same horizon swallow the same sun. He had built a life where nothing unexpected could reach him. No voices, no questions, no reminders of what he had been before the ground swallowed everything that mattered. Then 2 figures appeared on that horizon, walking straight toward his property with the kind of purpose that made his hands shake. The well pump groaned as Caleb filled the trough, his daily routine playing out with mechanical precision. Check the fence line feed, what little livestock remained, repair whatever the desert tried to reclaim overnight. The routine kept his mind from wandering into territories that still burned when he got too close. He had learned to live inside the smallest version of himself, and it had worked until now. The women were still half a mile out when he first spotted them. But even at that distance, something about their silhouettes felt wrong. Too tall, too deliberate. The way they moved suggested they knew exactly where they were headed, which meant they knew about him. In 8 years, only 3 people had made it this far out, and he had sent each one away before they could finish speaking. Townspeople looking for work, a preacher with salvation. He did not want a land surveyor who left after Caleb stood on his porch with a rifle across his arms, saying nothing. He watched the women close the distance, his throat tightening with each step they took. They wore traditional Apache dress, leather and fringe catching the harsh midday light, their long braids swaying with each stride. Both stood taller than any woman he had ever seen, their frames suggesting strength that had been earned through necessity rather than choice. They carried no visible supplies, no horses, no bags, just themselves and whatever determination had pushed them across miles of unforgiving territory to reach his door. Caleb moved toward the cabin, his mind already calculating exit routes, defensive positions, and whether he could reach the rifle propped inside the doorframe before they reached his property line. His hands had not stopped shaking since he first spotted them. The isolation he had carefully constructed suddenly felt less like protection and more like a trap of his own making. He had removed himself so completely from the world that he no longer understood the rules of basic human interaction. The older one raised her hand when they were 50 yards out, a gesture that could mean peace or pause or a dozen other things he had forgotten how to interpret. Her companion, slightly shorter but no less imposing, kept her eyes fixed on the well, on the water. Their pace slowed but did not stop. Caleb's pulse hammered against his ribs. Every instinct screamed to retreat. Inside, to lock the door, to pretend he had not seen them. But something in the way the younger woman looked at the water trough, not with threat, but with the kind of raw need that transcended language, kept his feet planted. They stopped at the edge of his property, a boundary marked only by habit and Caleb's own invisible lines. The older woman spoke first, her voice carrying across the space between them with unexpected gentleness. Water, one word. Simple, direct, the kind of request that should have been easy to answer. But Caleb's mouth had gone dry, and his mind raced through 1,000 complications that single word represented. Letting them onto his property meant acknowledging their existence. Acknowledging their existence meant his isolation had been breached. And if his isolation had been breached, then every wall he had built over 8 years suddenly meant nothing. The younger woman swayed, slightly, catching herself before her sister could reach out to steady her. Caleb saw it then. The exhaustion, the sunburn, the way her lips had started to crack from days without enough water. However long they had been walking it, had pushed them to their limit. He looked back at his cabin, at the life he had built from nothing in silence, then back at the 2 women who had somehow found him in the middle of nowhere. Something twisted in his chest, a sensation he had not felt in so long that it took him several heartbeats to recognize it. As the first crack in 8 years of carefully maintained numbness, before he could respond, before he could make the decision that would change everything. The sound of hoof beats rolled across the valley from the direction the women had come. Multiple horses moving fast and getting closer. The older woman's hand dropped to her side, her entire body tensing as she turned toward the sound. The younger one looked at Caleb with an expression that made his stomach drop. Not fear exactly, but something worse. Recognition of what was coming. Acceptance that whatever they had been running from had finally caught up. And standing between them and that approaching threat was a man who had spent 8 years trying to disappear from the world entirely. The dust cloud rose first, then the riders emerged. For men on horseback, their faces hard, with the kind of certainty that came from believing they were right. Caleb recognized the type immediately. Settlers who had claimed land and convinced themselves that claiming made it theirs by divine right. The kind who saw the world in simple categories and dealt with anything outside those categories through force. The older Apache woman positioned herself between her sister and the approaching riders, her stance shifting into something that suggested she had done this before many times. The younger one moved closer to Caleb's well, her eyes still fixed on the water she had not yet been permitted to drink. Caleb's hands had stopped shaking. In their place came a cold calculation he had not accessed in years. The rifle was 15 steps behind him. The riders were 200 yards out and closing. The women were unarmed and exhausted, and somewhere in the math of the next 60 seconds, he would have to decide which version of himself still existed under 8 years of deliberate eraser. Hugh Hartwell, the lead rider, called out as they pulled up short of the property line, their horses snorting and stamping. The man wore a deputy's badge that looked too new, too shiny, like authority that had been granted recently, and worn with the enthusiasm of someone still proving themselves worthy of it. Caleb said nothing. Speech felt like a betrayal of the silence he had maintained for so long. "We're looking for those too." The deputy gestured toward Nile and Kona with his chin. "Caught them stealing from the Brennan ranch 3 days back. Been tracking them since the accusation hung in the air like smoke." Caleb looked at the women, searching their faces for confirmation or denial. The older one, he had heard the younger call her Naili when they thought he was out of earshot, met his gaze with an expression that contained no plea, no justification, just a flat acceptance that whatever he decided would determine whether they survive the next hour. "They steal from you." Another rider spoke up, this one heavier, his face already red from sun and exertion. "Because we got every right to take back what's ours. Law says we can retrieve stolen property." Caleb found his voice, though it came out rougher than he remembered, scraped raw. "From disuse. Haven't stolen anything from me. That's not what we're saying." The deputy leaned forward in his saddle. "We're saying they stole from Brennan. We tracked them here. Now we're taking them back to answer for it." Kiona swayed, again, catching the edge of the water trough to steady herself. The movement was small but desperate, and it triggered something in Caleb's chest that felt uncomfortably close to the kind of feeling he had spent 8 years trying to bury. She was dying of thirst within arm's reach of water, and 5 men were discussing property rights and jurisdiction while she suffered. "Water's mine," Caleb said quietly. "They haven't taken any of it yet." The deputy's eyes narrowed. "You protecting them?" "I am stating facts." Caleb kept his voice level. "They're standing on my property. They haven't stolen from me. What they did or didn't do somewhere else isn't my concern. Then let us take them, and it won't be your concern." Caleb looked at Nile again. She stood perfectly still, her body coiled like she was preparing for violence, but hoping to avoid it. Her sister had gone pale, her grip on the trough edge turning her knuckles white. 3 days, running from these men. 3 days without adequate water. Whatever they had allegedly stolen, they had already paid for it in suffering. "Did you see them steal?" Caleb asked. The deputy's jaw tightened. "Brennan saw them near his. Near isn't theft. You calling Brennan a liar?" "I'm asking if anyone actually saw them take anything." The silence that followed told Caleb everything he needed to know. These men were hunting based on assumption and opportunity. The kind of justice that required no evidence beyond someone being in the wrong place at the wrong time or being the wrong kind of person in any place at all. The deputy's hand moved toward the revolver at his hip, a gesture meant to remind everyone present who held the power in this conversation. Step aside, Hartwell. This doesn't concern you. But Caleb had already made his decision, though he had not yet admitted it to himself. 8 years of isolation had not erased the part of him that recognized injustice when it stood on his property line. Exhausted and desperate for water, he controlled. "They're staying," he said, and felt the weight of 8 years of carefully constructed emptiness collapse around. Those two words, the writers exchanged glances, the kind of silent communication that suggested they had dealt with resistance before and knew exactly how to handle it. The deputy's hand remained near his revolver. "That's a mistake you're making," he said softly. Behind Caleb, the cabin door hung open. The rifle waited just inside, and between him and those weapons stood two women whose names he barely knew, and whose survival had somehow become the first thing he had cared about in nearly a decade. The deputy's horse shifted. Beneath him, sensing the tension that had settled over the property like morning frost, Caleb watched the man's hand hover near his revolver, watched the other three riders spread out slightly, creating angles that would make retreat difficult. They had done this before, surrounded people, made them reconsider poor decisions. "You don't know what you're protecting," the deputy said, his voice carrying the patience of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. "These two have been nothing but trouble since they showed up in the territory, moving between ranches, taking what doesn't belong to them. Water." Nayli spoke for the first time, her voice steady despite the exhaustion Caleb could see in the slight tremor of her legs. "We took water from a stream that runs through land that belonged to our people before your rancher built his fences." The deputy's expression hardened. "That land was purchased legal, recorded at the territorial office. What your people did or didn't own stopped mattering when you decided it stopped mattering," Kiona interrupted, her voice weaker than her sister's, but no less firm. "We took water from a stream, not from his well, not from his house. Water that flows free for anyone. Brennan says you took food from his storage." The heavy rider spat into the dirt. "3 chickens and a sack of grain. We took nothing." Naeli's hands remained at her sides, but Caleb noticed how her fingers had curled into fists. "We camped near the stream. We fished. We left before dawn. Your Brennan found us gone and decided we must have stolen something because that's what men like him believe about people like us." The deputy leaned back in his saddle, studying Caleb with renewed interest. "So, you're taking the word of 2 Apache women over established ranchers. You know what that makes you?" Caleb knew exactly what it made him. It made him the kind of person who chose sides based on evidence rather than convenience. The kind of person who recognized that 3 days of pursuit for allegedly stolen chickens suggested this had never been about theft at all. It made him someone who had just ended 8 years of carefully maintained neutrality with a declaration that would have consequences he could not yet predict. "Makes me someone who controls access to this water," Caleb said. "And right now, these women need it more than you need to prove something to Brennan." The riders exchanged glances again, a silent conference that ended with the deputy's jaw setting into a hard line. "You're making enemies you can't afford. Hartwell, you live out here alone." "No, neighbors for miles. Things can happen to isolated people. Accidents, misunderstandings." The thread hung between them, unsubtle and effective. Caleb felt his throat tighten, felt the old familiar fear of exposure and vulnerability trying to claw its way back into control. 8 years ago, he had learned exactly how fragile safety could be, how quickly everything could be taken away, how the world could savage you if you gave it the chance. But he had also learned something else in those years of isolation. He had learned that the worst thing that could happen to a person was not losing everything, It was having nothing worth, losing in the first place, and standing here with two exhausted women behind him and 5 men in front of him. Caleb realized he had just found something worth the risk. "Get off my property," he said quietly. The deputy's horse took a nervous step backward, responding to some shift in its rider's posture that Caleb could not quite read. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then the deputy smiled, but there was no humor in it. "We'll be back," he promised. "With the marshal and witnesses and legal authority you can't argue with." He pulled his horse around, the other riders following suit. "Enjoy your water while you can, all three of you." They rode off at a measured pace, unhurried, making it clear they were leaving by choice rather than compulsion. The dust from their horses' hooves drifted across Caleb's property line like smoke from a battle not yet finished. When they disappeared over the ridge, Caleb finally allowed himself to breathe. Behind him, he heard Kiona collapse to her knees beside the trough, her hands shaking as she cooped water to her mouth. Niley remained standing, her eyes still fixed on the horizon where the riders had vanished. "They will return," she said softly, "with more men, and they will not ask permission next time." Caleb turned to look at her properly for the first time. Up close, he could see the layers of exhaustion, the sun damage, the wear of people who had been running for far longer than 3 days. Whatever had brought them to his door had roots that went deeper than stolen chickens and territorial disputes. "How long have you been running?" he asked. Nali met his eyes, and in her gaze, Caleb saw something that made his stomach drop. Not fear, not even resignation, but a terrible bone-deep weariness that came from fighting a battle that could not be won, only prolonged since they decided we had no right to exist, she said. The cabin felt smaller with 3 people inside. Caleb had grown accustomed to solitude, to the way his footsteps echoed against bare walls and empty corners. Now the space contained breathing besides his own, contained lives that had become his responsibility the moment he chose. Protection over neutrality. Kiona sat near the window, her color slowly returning after drinking her fill from the well. Niley stood by the door, her posture still defensive despite the temporary safety. Neither woman had spoken since they entered, as if waiting for Caleb to explain why a man who lived alone for 8 years would suddenly risk everything for strangers. Caleb busied himself preparing simple food, bread, dried meat, water from the barrel he kept inside. His hands moved through familiar motions while his mind raced through calculations he had stopped making years ago. How many men would return? What legal authority did they actually possess? How long before this property became indefensible? You lost family. Nali spoke quietly. More statement than question. That's why you're here alone. Caleb's hands stilled over the bread. He had not spoken about it in 8 years, had not even allowed himself to think the words that would make it real again. But something about the way Nail stood there exhausted, hunted, yet still protecting her sister, made the walls he had built feel suddenly fragile. Wife and daughter, he heard himself say. Fever took them both. Within 3 days. I couldn't. His throat closed around the rest. Couldn't save them. Couldn't do anything but watch them suffer and fail despite every desperate attempt to help. So, you came here to die slowly instead of quickly. Niley said not unkindly. You chose to disappear. I chose to stop failing. People. Caleb set the bread down harder than intended. Out here, there's nobody to fail. Kiona spoke for the first time since collapsing at the well, her voice soft but clear. Until today, the words hung between them, undeniable. By choosing to protect them, Caleb had volunteered for exactly what he had spent 8 years avoiding. Responsibility for lives other than his own, the possibility of failure, the certainty of loss if things went wrong. Our mother died 6 years ago, Kiona continued. Our father 3 years before. That, the land they hunted on, the streams they fished, all claimed by settlers who arrived with papers that meant more than generations of our people living there. She looked at her sister. We stayed as long as we could. took only what we needed from land that had fed our family for lifetimes. But every year, the boundaries moved closer. The accusations came more frequently. They need us gone, Niley added flatly. Not because we've done anything, but because our existence reminds them that this land wasn't empty when they claimed it. We're evidence of theft. They'd rather forget. Caleb understood that burden, had carried his own version of it, the evidence of loss, the reminder of failure, the unbearable weight of continuing to exist when the people you loved did not. He had tried to erase himself from the world. The Apache sisters had the world trying to erase them. How many ranches have accused you? He asked. 5. In the past 2 years, Naeli's jaw tightened. Always. The same pattern. We camp nearby, use resources that used to be freely available to everyone. They notice us, assume theft, send men with authority to remove us. We run. Eventually, we'll run. Out of places to run to. And then, Nile did not answer, but her silence communicated everything. There was no, then, just the inevitable end point of people being pushed into smaller and smaller spaces until space ran out. Entirely, Caleb moved to the window, looking out at the horizon where the deputy and his men had disappeared. They would be gathering reinforcements now, making their case to whatever marshal-held jurisdiction, painting Caleb as a sympathizer, the women as criminals, the whole situation as simple law enforcement doing necessary work. I had a corral, he said quietly, before 12 horses. My daughter loved them. He had not spoken her name in 8 years and could not start now. After they died, I couldn't bear to see the animals. Sold them all. Tore down the corral, removed every reminder that I had ever been anything other than alone. He turned back to face the women. I thought emptiness was safety. Thought if I owned nothing and cared about nothing, I couldn't lose anything else. His hands had started shaking again, but for different reasons than before. I was wrong. Kiona met his eyes with an expression that contained understanding too deep for someone her age. You saved us today. Maybe. Caleb looked at the rifle mounted above the door. Or maybe I just delayed something that can't be stopped. They're coming back with authority I can't argue against, and numbers I can't match. Then why did you do it? Niley asked. Why choose this? Caleb thought about his daughter's face, about his wife's hand in his during those final hours, about 8 years of breathing without living. He thought about 2 women walking across impossible distance for a drink of water, about men with badges and certainty, about how easy it would have been to turn away and preserve the emptiness he had convinced himself was peace. Because I'm tired of disappearing, he said finally. Outside, the sun had started its descent toward evening. In a few hours, darkness would make approach difficult, but morning would come, and with it, the consequences of every choice made today. The deputy had promised to return. Caleb believed him. The question now was not whether they would come, but whether. Caleb could remember how to be the kind of man who stood his ground when everything he had spent 8 years building was about to be torn apart. Night fell across the territory like a curtain drawn against witness. Caleb sat on the porch, rifle across his knees, watching the darkness for movement that might signal early arrival. Behind him, through the open cabin door, he could hear the quiet conversation of the sisters speaking in their own language. The words meant nothing to him, but the tone communicated everything. Exhaustion mixed with resignation, gratitude, tangled with guilt. They knew what their presence had cost him, what it would continue to cost. Na emerged from the cabin, moving with the careful quiet of someone trained to leave no trace of their passing. She settled beside Caleb, without asking permission, her eyes adjusting to the darkness with practiced ease. You should sleep, she said. I can. Watch. I haven't slept well in 8 years. Caleb kept his gaze on the horizon. A few more hours won't matter. Your wife and daughter. Niley paused, choosing words carefully. The fever. There was nothing you could have done. I rode 2 days to fetch a doctor. He was attending another emergency. By the time I return alone, My daughter was already gone. My wife followed 12 hours later. Caleb's grip tightened on the rifle. I couldn't save them. Couldn't even be there at the end. So you've been punishing yourself ever since. The observation was too accurate to argue against. Caleb had convinced himself that isolation was protection, but Niley had identified the truth. It was penance. 8 years of refusing to live because he had failed to keep others alive. What will you do when they return? Niley asked. Tell them the truth, that you took nothing from me, that any accusations against you happen elsewhere and aren't my concern. Even as he said it, Caleb knew how inadequate it sounded. Truth mattered less than power, and the men returning would have both authority and numbers on their side. They won't accept that. No. Caleb finally looked at her. They won't. Then why are we still here? Why not leave before they come back and make this your problem? It was the practical question, the one Caleb had been avoiding since sunset. Letting the sisters leave would solve everything. He could return to his isolation, claim ignorance about where they went, rebuild the walls that had kept him safe from caring about anything. Because if you leave tonight, you'll be running again tomorrow, he said quietly. And the day after, until eventually there's nowhere left to run, and someone decides that removing you permanently is easier than chasing you forever, and you can stop that. No. Caleb's honesty surprised even himself. But I can make them explain themselves. Make them prove their accusations instead of just asserting them. Make it harder for this to be simple. Niley studied him in the darkness. Her expression unreadable. You're risking everything for two strangers because you feel guilty about people you couldn't save 8 years ago. Maybe. Caleb stood pacing to the edge of the porch. Or maybe I'm finally doing something that matters more than my guilt. Inside the cabin, Kiona had fallen asleep, her breathing deep, and even with the rhythm of someone who had not felt safe enough to rest properly in weeks. The sound of it, that simple evidence of trust, made something in Caleb's chest tighten painfully. She believes you'll protect us, Niley said softly. She has more faith in people than I do. What do you believe? Niley was quiet for a long moment. Then I believe you'll try. Whether trying will be enough, she shrugged. We'll know by tomorrow. The night stretched on, marked by the distant calls of animals and the whisper of wind through dry grass. Caleb thought about his daughter, about how she used to sit beside him on this same porch when it had been part of a different life entirely. How she had trusted him to keep her safe, and how that trust had meant nothing against fever and distance and the cruel mathematics of timing. He could not save his daughter, could not bring back his wife, could not reclaim 8 years spent hiding from everything that made existence meaningful. But he could be here now with a rifle and a choice, and 2 women who had walked across impossible terrain for water he controlled. Maybe redemption was not about erasing past failures. Maybe it was about refusing to repeat them. As dawn approached, painting the horizon in shades of gray that promised sunrise, Caleb saw the dust cloud rising in the distance. More horses than before, moving with the confidence of people who expected no real resistance. They're coming, he said unnecessarily. Nieli stood beside him, her sister emerging from the cabin to join them. The 3 of them stood on that porch, watching the approach of men who carried authority and certainty, and the kind of justice that required no evidence beyond assumption. Caleb checked the rifle, making sure it was loaded, despite knowing he would not fire it. Violence would only prove them right about him. This would have to end some other way. He just had no idea what that way might be. 8 riders this time. The deputy from yesterday led them, but beside him rode an older man whose bearings suggested genuine authority rather than borrowed confidence. The marshal, Caleb, assumed. Behind them came Brennan himself, recognizable by the expensive horse and clothing that marked prosperity, along with 5 more men whose faces carried the hard certainty of those convinced they were enforcing justice. They stopped at the property line again, but this time their formation suggested they had no intention of leaving without resolution. The marshal dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate as he approached on foot, a gesture meant to appear reasonable. Caleb understood. The appearance of diplomacy before force became necessary. Caleb Hartwell. The marshal's voice carried the weariness of someone who had mediated too many disputes and expected this to be just another. I Marshal Ruiz. Need to have a conversation with you about the two women you're harboring. Not harboring. Caleb remained on the porch, rifle held, loosely but visibly. They're guests on my property. Haven't broken any laws I can see. That's not for you to determine. Brennan urged his horse forward, his face flushed with the indignation of someone unaccustomed to being defied. Those two stole from me. I have every right to retrieve my property and see them answer for their crimes. What exactly did they steal? Caleb asked. Brennan's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. 3 chickens, a sack of grain. Items from my storage shed. Did you see them take these items? I saw them camping near my property. When I checked my stores the next morning, items were missing. Brennan said it like the logic was self-evident. Who else could have been? Anyone passing through your land? Caleb suggested. Any of your workers? Wild animals getting into poorly secured storage? The marshal held up a hand before Brennan could respond. Mr. Hart. Well, I understand your instinct to question, but we've had multiple complaints about these two women over the past months. They show up near ranches, stay a few days, then move on, and property goes missing. The pattern suggests someone is using them as convenient explanations for losses that might have nothing to do with them, Caleb interrupted, or everything to do with the fact that they're easy to blame and have nobody to defend them. They're Apache, the deputy said flatly, as if that explained everything. They're people, Caleb countered, and last I checked, being Apache wasn't a crime. Neither was camping near a stream or needing water to survive. The marshal's expression tightened with frustration. This isn't about what they are. It's about what they've done. Then prove it. Caleb descended from the porch, placing himself between the riders and the cabin door. Show me evidence. Bring witnesses who actually saw them commit theft. Present something beyond assumption and convenience. The word of established ranchers should be sufficient, Brennan snapped. We've built this territory, created prosperity where there was nothing. Our testimony carries weight. Your testimony carries prejudice, Niley said from the doorway, her voice cutting through the posturing with unexpected force. You want us gone because our existence reminds you that this prosperity you speak of was built on land taken from people who lived here for generations before you arrived with your papers and your certainty. We purchased this land legally. Brennan began from whom? Niley stepped onto the porch beside Caleb. Who sold you land that belonged to no single person, that was shared by communities who never conceived of dividing earth and water into pieces that could be owned? The marshal's hand moved to his revolver, not drawing, but establishing its presence. This conversation is heading in an unproductive direction. Mr. Hartwell, I'm asking you politely to let us take these women into custody. They'll have a fair hearing. If they're innocent, they'll be released, and if I refuse, then you're interfering with legal authority. That makes you complicit in whatever crimes they've committed. The marshal's tone hardened. I don't want to arrest you, but I will, if you force this. Caleb looked at the 8 men arrayed before him, at their weapons and their horses and their absolute conviction that might and authority were equivalent to truth. He thought about his wife and daughter, about 8 years of choosing emptiness over risk, about 2 women who had walked across territories with nothing but each other, and the desperate hope that someone somewhere might choose justice over convenience. I'm not refusing, he said slowly. I'm demanding you meet the same standard you'd require if these accusations were against anyone else. Bring evidence, real evidence, not assumptions based on who they are or where they camped. The riders exchanged glances, their confidence wavering slightly in the face of logic they had not expected to encounter. Brennan looked ready to argue further, but the marshal held up a hand. We'll return, he said quietly, with more than accusations. And when we do, Mr. Hartwell, You'd best hope you're on the right side of this. They turned their horses and rode off, but slower this time, less certain. Caleb watched them disappear over the ridge, knowing he had won nothing except time. Time for what? He could not say, but it was more than the sisters had possessed yesterday. Behind him, Kiona spoke softly. They will bring false evidence, manufacture, proof, make the accusations impossible to disprove. Caleb knew she was right, but he had learned something in the past day that 8 years of isolation had almost made him forget. Sometimes fighting impossible battles was the only way to remember you were still alive. The afternoon stretched long and tense. Marked by preparation, neither Caleb nor the sisters discussed explicitly, but all understood was necessary. Nayli walked the property perimeter, her eyes cataloging approaches and vulnerabilities with the expertise of someone who had learned survival through necessity. Kiona helped Caleb secure supplies, moving with renewed strength. Now that water and rest had restored some of what exhaustion had stolen. You should leave, Caleb said as he checked the water barrels. Both of you, before they return with whatever evidence they plan to manufacture, head north toward the territories where the laws are less established, where men like Brennan have less reach. And you, Nali asked from the doorway, what happens to you after we disappear? They'll assume you helped us escape. That makes you complicit. Either way, she was right. The moment Caleb chose to defend them, he had bound his fate to theirs. Running would not change that. It would only confirm every accusation they wanted to make. Then we face it together, Kiona said quietly. All three of us. If this is the place where running stops, at least we stop together. Caleb looked at the sisters. These two women who had walked into his isolation asking for water and somehow given him back something he had thought permanently lost. Not happiness exactly. Not peace, but purpose. The kind that came from choosing to stand for something beyond survival. My daughter's name was Sarah, he heard himself say. The first time he had spoken it aloud since her death. She was 7 when the fever took her. She used to sit on this porch and name every star she could see. His throat tightened, but he pushed through. My wife was Rebecca. She grew vegetables in a plot behind the cabin. Corn and beans and squash. She could make a meal from nothing and make it taste like everything. The sisters waited, understanding that this sharing cost something, that it represented. Trust Caleb had not extended to anyone in 8 years. When they died, I thought my life ended too. Thought the only way to survive losing them was to stop living in any meaningful way. Caleb sat heavily on the porch steps. I've spent 8 years proving myself right, building a life so empty that nothing could hurt me because nothing mattered. Until yesterday, Niley said, until 2 women walked across impossible territory to ask for water I could give or withhold based on nothing but my own choice. Caleb looked up at them. You reminded me that choosing to care is what makes us human. That refusing to care doesn't protect us from pain. It just guarantees we die without ever having really lived. Kiona settled beside him on the steps, her presence solid and real in a way that cut through 8 years of deliberate numbness. Our mother used to say that water flows where it will regardless of the boundaries people draw. That trying to own what should be shared only creates drought for everyone. Is that why you kept taking water from streams that crossed ranch property? Caleb asked. We took water because we needed it to live. Na said simply, the streams flowed long before ranchers built fences around them. They'll flow long after those fences rot and fall. But men like Brennan C. are drinking from those streams as theft because they've convinced themselves that ownership of land means ownership of everything that crosses it. Water, wind, light itself if they could fence it. They'll come back with witnesses, Caleb said. Men willing to swear they saw you steal, even if they never laid eyes on you before today. The law will be on their side. At least the version of law that matters out here. Then why are we still here? Kiona asked. Why not leave while we can? Because I'm tired of running, Natalie answered before Caleb could speak. She looked at her sister with an expression that contained years of exhaustion and defiance in equal measure. We've been running since Father died, moving from place to place, taking only what we needed, trying to exist in the margins of a world that's decided we don't belong anywhere. I'm tired of it. Tired of being accused without defense. Tired of seeing that look in people's eyes that says we're guilty of existing. So, we stand here, Kiona said softly. And if they come with their false witnesses and manufactured evidence, we force them to go through with it. Make them say out loud what this is really about. Caleb understood what they were offering. Not escape, but witness. They would stay and force the truth into daylight. Even if that truth cost them everything, it was the kind of courage that came from having nothing left to lose except dignity. Then we face it together, he agreed. When they return, we stand our ground. We demand they prove their accusation. We make this harder than they expected. As the sun descended toward evening, casting long shadows across property Caleb had once believed would be his fortress against feeling anything at all, the three of them sat together on the porch, not speaking much but not needing to. The silence between them was no longer the empty kind Caleb had cultivated for 8 years. It was the silence of people, preparing for battle, finding strength and shared resolve. Somewhere beyond the ridge, men were gathering evidence that would condemn based on prejudice rather than truth. Somewhere in the territorial office, papers were being prepared that would make the sisters' removal legal and final. Somewhere in the dark territories beyond settled lands, there might still be places where 2 Apache women could live without constant accusation. But none of that mattered as much as the choice they had all made to stop running and start standing. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. Tonight they had each other, and the kind of defiance that came from deciding your humanity was worth defending regardless of cost. The stars emerged one by one. The same stars Caleb's daughter had once named. He looked up at them and allowed himself to remember not just the loss, but the love that made loss possible. For the first time in 8 years, the memory did not destroy him. Dawn arrived with the dust cloud Caleb had been expecting since midnight. But this time the composition surprised him. The marshal rode at the front, Brennan beside him as before. But behind them came additional riders Caleb recognized from town. Merchants, a doctor, even the man who ran the general store. Not all allies of Brennan. Then something had changed overnight. The marshal dismounted with the same deliberate courtesy as yesterday, but his expression carried less certainty. Mr. Hartwell, we need to resolve this situation. I agree. Caleb remained on the porch, the sisters flanking him. Have you brought the evidence you promised? Brennan urged his horse forward, producing a burlap sack. Found. This hidden near where they were camping. Contains items from my property. Distinctive items I can identify. May I see them? The doctor spoke up, surprising everyone. He was an older man, weathered by years of frontier practice. His reputation for fairness well known. Before accusations are finalized, I like to examine this evidence. The marshal nodded, taking the sack and passing it to the doctor. The man opened it carefully, removing items one by one. A worn shirt, a cooking pot, a leather pouch containing dried meat. He examined each piece with the same methodical attention he likely applied to diagnosing illness. This shirt, the doctor said slowly holding it up, has initials sewn inside. JB, that would be your initials, Brennan. Yes, it's but it's also patched with fabric I recognize. I sold this exact cloth to Marcus Chin 2 months ago. He bought it to repair his workers' clothing. The doctor's expression hardened. This shirt was never yours, Brennan. It belonged to someone who worked your ranch and moved on. Brennan's face flushed. That doesn't prove the pot has a McCaker's mark from Santa Fe, the doctor continued. I know. This because my wife has the matching set. These were sold last year to at least a dozen families passing through. And this dried meat. He sniffed it carefully. Antelope. The sisters were seen fishing, not hunting. Where would they have gotten antelope meat? The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush. Caleb watched realization. spread across the faces of the other riders. They had been brought to witness justice, but were instead witnessing something far more damning. You planted these items, the doctor said flatly, gathered things that could belong to anyone and claimed they were stolen because you needed evidence to support accusations you'd already decided were true. I know what I saw, Brennan began. You saw two Apache women existing near your property, Niley interrupted, her voice cutting through his bluster like a blade. And you decided that was crime enough, so you manufactured proof to make your prejudice look like justice. The marshal's hand moved to his badge, and for a moment, Caleb thought he might remove it in shame. Instead, he turned to Brennan with an expression that promised consequences. You've wasted official time with false accusations, made me complicit in harassment of innocent people. They're not innocent, Brennan tried. They're guilty of being Apache and needing water, the doctor said quietly. In your mind, that's crime enough. But the law requires actual theft, not assumption and manufactured evidence. One of the merchants spoke up, a man Caleb vaguely remembered from years ago. Brennan's done this before. Last year blamed missing grain on a family passing through. They left before we could question it properly. Made me wonder then. No, now the unraveling happened. Quickly after that, other voices joined in, sharing suspicions they had harbored but not voiced until this moment gave them courage. Brennan's reputation crumbled under the weight of pattern and practice. His authority, exposed as nothing more than convenient prejudice given the veneer of respectability. The marshal turned to the sisters. You're free to go with my apology for the harassment you've suffered. Where we go? Kiona asked. Simply, every territory has men like Brennan. Every stream we drink from crosses someone's claimed property. The merchant who had spoken earlier cleared his throat. My brother runs a trading post 3 days north near the reservation. Boundaries. He's always looking for people who know the land, know how to survive what the territory throws at them. It's not paradise, but it's work and it's legal. Nieli and Kiona exchanged glances, a wordless conversation passing between them. Then Nieli looked at Caleb. Thank you for standing when you didn't have to. Thank you, Caleb replied, for reminding me why. Standing matters. The riders dispersed slowly, Brennan departing last with the marshal's hand firmly on his shoulder, promising investigation and consequences. The doctor lingered, approaching the porch with the careful manner of someone who understood the weight of what had just transpired. You've made enemies today, Hartwell, he said quietly. Men like Brennan have long memories. I've spent 8 years making enemies of myself, Caleb replied. Other people's hatred feels lighter by comparison. The sisters prepared to leave that afternoon, gathering what few supplies Caleb could spare. Kiona hugged him with surprising strength, while Nieli simply nodded. Her respect conveyed through gesture rather than words. Caleb watched them ride north on horses the merchant had provided, their figures gradually shrinking against the vast territory until they disappeared entirely. His property felt empty again, but different than before, not the hollow emptiness of isolation, but the peaceful emptiness of space temporarily unoccupied. He looked at the well, at the water that had started everything, a simple request, a choice to care when caring was difficult. He thought about Sarah naming stars, about Rebecca growing vegetables, about 8 years spent. Try to stop feeling anything at all. Then he walked back inside, leaving the door open to the afternoon light, ready for whatever came next. He had learned that isolation was not safety, that caring meant risking loss, that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was give water to strangers who asked for it, and that was enough. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and justice collide in unexpected ways. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.